My name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, and I wanted to welcome you all to our lunch at the library. This is our new attempt to have a lunchtime convening for people, members of the public who want to have some learning during their lunchtime. So I'm glad to see so many people come out, and I encourage you all to tell your friends, your neighbors, even your enemies about this lunch. A couple of announcements. First off, this is called Lunch at the Library, which is a bit of a misnomer. This is not the library, although 300,000 books are all residing above you right now. But across the street is Library Hall. That's where we hold 14 million pages of manuscripts. We have the papers of Benjamin Franklin, the journals of Lewis and Clark, materials that relate to over 650 different Native American communities, and the papers of 7 Nobel laureates. So if you want to learn more about our library, check it out online. And then across the street from the library is our museum. The exhibition, our next exhibition, is opening on March 31st. It's an exhibition that highlights a core part of our collecting. It's exploring women in science, so we're hoping to excavate and highlight the pioneering work of many women scientists whose papers reside now in our vaults. So that's opening on March 31st. And our next lunch at the library is March 15th, and that is Rebecca Cypress, and she'll be coming to talk about 18th century music. That will be followed on April 13th by Susan Brandt, and she's going to be talking about women healers in 18th century Philadelphia. So I hope to see you all there, along with some new friends and maybe even some of those enemies. But today, I'm thrilled to introduce Greg Nobles. I have known Greg for longer than he realizes. Because when you're a scholar, you first meet somebody through their work, through their books. And so Greg's early work on frontiers, on the American Revolution, was very influential for me. It was required reading in graduate school. And now I've gotten to know Greg as a person through his research. He has been actively engaged in research in the library across the street for his most recent book on Audubon, which I highly recommend to all of you. Greg has been a scholar, a remarkable scholar of early American history, but he's also been a noted administrator. And when I looked up his biography, he had all these administrative positions, and I couldn't believe how much work he turned out while also being an administrator, including being the founding director of the Honors College at Georgia Institute of Technology, where he was a professor for decades. Today, though, he's here to talk about his most recent book on the education of Betsey Stockton. And so with that, Greg, I think I'll just turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That was very kind, although I think the term noted administrator might be a contradiction in terms. I'd also like to thank Adriana Link for her help in getting this whole talk set up, and Jeremy and Todd and Thomas for help this morning. So thank you very much. And thanks to all of you, of course. Thanks to you for being here today, and to whoever might be here virtually out there in Zoom land. It really is wonderful to be here, because I've found APS to be such a very welcoming place. I note today the piano is covered, so I won't be able to sing for my supper, but I will lecture for my lunch. But I'm here to talk about, yes, Betsey Stockton. Especially the Philadelphia part of her life. But to begin, I want to talk about her life and where it fits into a bigger picture. Betsey Stockton is, yes, she's a very obscure figure in history, but I think she's a fascinating figure as well. She's someone I think deserves a bigger place in history, and that's what I've tried to do in writing this book about her, is to bring her into history, bring her into this larger narrative of American history. Now, when I started doing research in the book about 5 years ago, I knew the basic outlines of Betsey Stockton's life, and I'll give you a very, very quick overview of that just for a minute, and I'll save time and be happy to answer any questions you might have during the Q&A period later. So bear with me for a minute, just for a quick tour. Betsey Stockton was born in Princeton, New Jersey, and born into slavery in 1798, always with a question mark, because the man who possessed her in the household, Robert Stockton, didn't record her birth. Robert Stockton was a very prominent member of a very prominent family in Princeton, and also a slaveholder. Betsey Stockton's mother was an enslaved woman in Robert Stockton's household, probably a woman named Celia. The man involved was probably one of Robert Stockton's sons. In fact, I had a descendant of Robert Stockton write and say which son he thought it was. It was Job Stockton because Job was a little bit weird. I don't know. But then, a very important move. Sometime before 1804, Betsey Stockton is given to Robert Stockton's daughter, Elizabeth Stockton Green, who was the wife of Ashbel Green, a very prominent figure in the Presbyterian Church, especially here in Philadelphia. Ashbel Green is also a very prominent figure in Betsey Stockton's life, throughout her life. He's a graduate of Princeton, or the College of New Jersey, it's called at the time, in 1783, the valedictorian of his class of 14 students. He comes to Philadelphia and becomes pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church here in Philadelphia, and that's shown in the image there. He's elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1789, and he becomes one of the two chaplains to the Congress in the 1790s while the Congress is sitting here in Philadelphia. Ashbel Green is also a slaveholder because he has this young enslaved child in his household. Now, I have to say, Ashbel Green's very uneasy about being a slaveholder. In fact, he emancipates Betsey from slavery probably in 1807, I think certainly by 1810, but he still keeps her in some form of unfreedom, perhaps as an indentured servant. She's not a completely free person. And I have to note that both Pennsylvania and New Jersey have have gradual abolition laws, but abolition laws where abolition is very, very gradual. And I can discuss that later, perhaps, in the Q&A. Anyway, Betsey lives in Ashbel Green's household until 1812 here in Philadelphia. Then he becomes president of Princeton, president of the College of New Jersey, and he takes her to Princeton with him. But in 1813, just the following year, Green sells 3 years of her time to another Presbyterian pastor in Woodbury, New Jersey, just across the river. And so she goes there for 3 years. Finally, in 1816, she comes back to Princeton, back to Ashbel Green, until finally in 1822. She's now a free woman. She joins a group of Protestant missionaries heading off to the Sandwich Islands, what's now Hawaii. And they're leaving from New Haven in 1822 on a whaling ship called the Thames, which is how they pronounce it in Connecticut. She is the only black person on board that ship. She is the only single woman. And she's somewhere in the crowd there from this woodcut. But on that trip, while she's sailing the 5-month voyage down the Atlantic, around Cape Horn, and across the Pacific, it's a very long and very hazardous journey, she becomes very, very close friends, lifelong friends, with a married couple, a very newly married couple among the missionaries, Charles Samuel Stewart and Harriet Bradford Tiffany Stewart. In fact, she midwifes the birth of their first child on board the ship in April of 1823 while they're on their way to Hawaii. She later helps in the birth of 2 of their daughters, and she's a very, very close member, frankly, of the Stewart family. When she arrives in Hawaii in 1823, she becomes a teacher on the island of Maui in Lahaina, and she's the first one of the American missionaries to teach ordinary people. Typically, the missionaries would teach members of the elite, the children of the elite, but Betsey Stockton goes another step. She teaches the ordinary people. But Harriet Stewart becomes ill, has to leave the islands, and Betsey Stockton goes back to the United States with them, with the Stewarts, to Cooperstown, New York. And I think her friendship with the Stewarts is a very critical element in her life, and it's something I'll come back to a couple of times. But she goes back with them, leaves Hawaii, where she thought she was going to spend the rest of her life, but she leaves and goes to Cooperstown. She stays there 2 years until 1828, and she comes to Philadelphia. She gets a job as the first principal of the first infant school for black children in the city, and that's what I'm going to talk about primarily today. She does that for 2 years, then she goes back to Cooperstown in 1830 to 1833, and finally, she comes back to Princeton. And that's where she lives the rest of her life. From 1833 to 1865, she is a leader, a teacher in the community, in the black community. She's a founding member of Princeton's main black Presbyterian church, the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, which is still there and thriving. She's a founder and the sole teacher in Princeton's only public school for black children, and she does that from the 1830s on until the time she dies. And she dies in 1865 at age 67, and instead of being buried in Princeton, she's buried in Cooperstown with the Stewart family, and that was her tombstone. And that's Betsey Stockton's life. It sounds almost exhausting, I think. It's exhausting for me to recount, probably exhausting for you to hear, but I think exhausting for her to have lived as well. I mean, she does all this travel by her mid-30s, from Princeton to Philadelphia, around the world and back again, and she's still, in her mid-30s. And in writing about Betsey Stockton's travels, I use the term, in fact, I use it in the subtitle, the term Odyssey, and I want to be clear about that. Odyssey, I think, has become kind of a throwaway term for just anybody's long trip, a voyage, and yet I tend to use it in the way Homer used it in writing about Odysseus at the end of the Trojan War. He's coming home, Odysseus is, after a long voyage, yes, but it's a voyage that's full of threats and obstacles and dangers, and that's what makes Homer's Odyssey such a compelling tale. And I think Betsey Stockton, in her own way, in her own time, in her own voyage, faces similar kinds of threats and obstacles and dangers, not quite as fanciful as those Homer writes about, but nonetheless significant. Well, there you have it. That's what I knew about Betsey Stockton's life when I started work. That's the basic outline of her life. What I didn't know at the time, was what to make of her place in history, how to write her history. And that was a very big challenge when I began this work. And part of that challenge came from the scarcity of sources. All we have in Betsey Stockton's own hand is a journal, the journal she wrote while on her voyage to Hawaii, and it's a fascinating piece of work. It's a journal published by, of all people, Ashbel Green. There are a couple of letters, her will and testament, last will and testament, which is an interesting document, a few other scraps, but that's it. That's it. Not much written by Betsey Stockton. Now, that's a common problem when we do research that comes up frequently, especially for black people, people of color, people who've lived in the past. And there's I think one of the crises, one of the challenges for people writing about, for historians writing about people of color, is that the archive, as extensive as this archive is, it's rather limited for black people. So what do you do? What do you do? You learn to take the scraps that you get. You learn to make of them what you can. You see where Betsey Stockton is. You try to see what Betsey Stockton's doing. And you try to see what other people are saying about her. And a lot of the information I have about Betsey Stockton comes from what people have written about her. Now, that has to be taken skeptically. You have to read it against the grain sometimes, because quite often it's white people who are writing about her, and you have to be wary of what their position is about her as a black person. But I think also it's always important to be aware of the larger historical context. And the part of that context I want to talk about today is her time in Philadelphia, her Philadelphia story, if you will, that runs from 1828 to 1830. It's only 2 years, but I think a very significant period in her life. In the winter of 1828, she's living with the Stewarts up in Cooperstown, and she gets a job offer in the mail, and it's to be principal of a new school in Philadelphia, an infant school for black children 2 to 5 years old, and I'll talk about what an infant school is more in a moment. But the woman who writes her, a woman named Amelia Davison, says they found a site for this school. It's at 60 Gaskell Street, which is still with us, down a little bit south of Lombard, just a 3-block street. It's a growing black neighborhood. The red spot is Betsey Stockton's school, and you can see the population of the African-American community that's grown up around that in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. So they've got a good spot. They have a good teaching space. Ms. Davison says they have a large and airy and well-calculated space for the purpose. And they can pay Betsey Stockton. They're going to pay her $200 a year, which is very decent money at the time, especially for a black woman. The occupational opportunities for black women, as you can imagine, were very, very limited. It's a good offer, and Betsey Stockton takes it. But I think there's another element in her doing so. I think a psychological and emotional element, too. In coming to Philadelphia, Betsey Stockton is going back to the place where she spent her childhood as an enslaved child. She never went to school a day in her life. She was completely self-educated. In fact, and I always point out, she wasn't just literate, she was intellectual. She had a remarkable range of reading, which I can talk about that, too. But now, back in Philadelphia, she's a free woman, and she can bring education to black children in Philadelphia, give them what she had never had herself. And I think that becomes part of her calling, her commitment, an extension, if you will, of her mission. She gets to Philadelphia in April of 1828. The school opens on May 1st, and it seems to be going very well. Enrollment grows quickly from 46 to 66, just in about a month. Good work. But here's a question for Betsey Stockton and a question for us. What is an infant school anyway? How does it work? Well, I'm not going to go into great detail about the inner workings of infant schools. It's in the book. But I can tell you that the idea started in London. A man named Samuel Witherspoon, working in the Spitalfields neighborhood, a working class area of London, created the first infant school in 1819. And the idea, the infant part of it is very easy. Focus on 2 to 5-year-olds. It's a preschool, a little bit like Head Start today, a school for children of the poor, a program for children who might otherwise be out in the streets, might otherwise become subject to evil influences, children who might be left without parental care. That's the infant part. The school part is a bit more complex. It's based upon the ideas, the writings of Johann Pestalozzi, a Swiss education theorist, and it provides a very, very challenging curriculum. And as I read the infant school curriculum, and perhaps as you can read it, well, perhaps not, but I will assure you it's more than just games. There's for 2 to 5-year-olds, it's spelling, it's reading, it's arithmetic, it's geometry, it's natural history, it's religions, it's hymns, and it's also movement. I love this picture. You know, the children are marching, they're playing with shapes. I think it's a little bit like a Montessori school today in terms of its approach to education. In any event, infant schools in the 1820s are a new thing. They're the newest thing in education. They spread from London to Boston to Hartford to New York and to Philadelphia. And that's where we find Betsey Stockton in May of 1828. She comes here, starts the school, opens it up, does remarkably well. In fact, she does so well that the white women, the visiting committee, vote to give her a raise from $200 to $250, a 25% increase in 1 month. We should all wish for that. And they keep submitting glowing reports about her work. The school is interesting. It's encouraging. It's flourishing. The children are very fond of their teachers. And I think the best evidence of Betsey Stockton's quality as a teacher comes in the summer of 1828, July of 1828. The school had been open for a couple of months, and for whatever reason, it's unclear, Betsey Stockton has to take some time off. She's sick. Her assistant, Rebecca Cobb, is also out, and so there are no teachers. And so the visiting committee of white women decides, we'll take over. We'll run the school. And you know what's going to happen. How hard can it be, they think. And yet they suffer the fate of substitute teachers everywhere. It's chaos. They've got 60, maybe 70 kids, all under the age of 5, and it just ruins them. So later the visiting committee writes that it'd be most expedient to dismiss the school until the teachers should be able to resume their duties. So Betsey Stockton and her assistant, Rebecca Cobb, do come back, and all is well again. And if we were to stop there, it's a great Betsey Stockton success story. A woman born into slavery, gains her freedom, becomes a missionary, goes around the world to Hawaii and back, gets a good job in Philadelphia, gets a good salary, then gets a big raise. She does good work for black children, and white people seem to like her. And if that were it would be a good story, it'd be a nice story, the end. But that's not the end. That's not the whole story. And again, I want to see Betsey Stockton, I want to see her Odyssey to that larger context in which she lives, and in this case, in which she works. And especially, of course, in the 1820s, the racial context. White people hire a black woman to run a school for black children, and we have to ask, what's going on? First, Betsey Stockton's school is the school, infant school for black children in Philadelphia. There are 3 others. The yellow squares are white infant schools. And the infant schools are racially separated, they're racially segregated. Maybe nothing too surprising about that, but nonetheless, I think it's significant. But it's not just the children that are segregated, so is the money that goes to support them. The infant school report from 1828 sets it out very clearly, that the funds collected for the black school, Betsey Stockton School, are to be kept wholly apart from those collected or hereafter be collected for white children. No monetary miscegenation. There are lots of donors for the white schools, and this is only a partial list for 1829. There are 2 categories of donors. The life donors, large donors who contribute $20 a year, and then everybody else, the smaller donors who give $2 a year. And you can see the large donors tend to be men and women. The smaller donors, the $2 donors, are mostly women, and they're identified by Mrs. and Miss, and so you can see which ones are married, which ones are single. This goes on for pages, and I think if you had a Philadelphia city directory, you could find out exactly, who is and what are the communities and networks within this. The donors for the so-called colored school are not as numerous. Some of them are white women, but also you can see some names of very prominent Philadelphia African Americans, names like Cassie and Douglas and Fortin, and then a larger number of smaller black donors at $1. I'm going to pause here for a public service announcement because I see the name James Fortin, and there's an exhibit just around the corner at the Museum of the American Revolution about black founders, focusing on James Fortin, but also the people around him. It is excellent, and it provides a much larger context for the situation in Betsey Stockton I'm talking about today, so please go see it. Here, though, is a summary of the donors for the black and white schools in 1829. For the white schools, there are 75 men, 352 women. For the black school, there are 5 men and 26 women. And so on one level, Philadelphia's infant schools are racially segregated for the children and financially segregated for the donors, and of course, highly gendered here too. And I think, you think about, here are women, mostly white women, some of them single, making small dollar donations, and the focus is here on children. This is, I think, is a great story about female philanthropy in early Philadelphia. But it's also a story about male authority, because the Board of Advisors for the Infant School Society is all men. And the energy resides in one man in particular, Mathew Carey. You know him. Mathew Carey, Philadelphia's famous publisher, philanthropist, polemicist, and elected member of APS in 1821. But in the late 1820s, Mathew Carey, he's retired from his publishing business. His sons are running it, but he becomes very interested, very focused on two particular issues, two causes. First, back up, is infant schools. He becomes the great promoter in Philadelphia of infant schools. And he makes the standard argument, and you can read it here. The children are subject to danger and disorder if they're out in the streets, but if they come into an infant school and be cared for in a wholesome environment, where they can experience social reform, they'll become cleanly and orderly, docile, happy. And he says, as bidding fair to be useful members of society at some future day. That's a good promotion for infant schools. That is the classic argument, whether it's about white or black infant schools. But I think Mathew Carey's other cause in the 1820s also raises questions for that future day for black children, what sort of society they might become useful members of. Mathew Carey, by the 1820s, has become converted, to use his own term, converted to the cause of African colonization. Now, at the time, African colonization as an organized movement was a little over 10 years old. It had been started in 1816 by Robert Finley, one of Ashbel Green's students at Princeton, frankly. And colonization was one of those issues that could have multiple meanings. For some people, including some black Americans, enslaved and free, the idea of colonization was to send people to Africa, black people to Africa, or as many people said, back to Africa, even though many black people had never been in Africa in their lives. But it might have seemed like, on one level, a rather benign answer to American racism. That is, to give black people a refuge on the far side of the Atlantic, give them their own homeland in Africa, Liberia. And that was, frankly, the benign explanation for colonization. And some people, both black and white, bought it, at least for a while. I will say by the 1820s, most black people had rejected colonization, and it really was a white movement. But the less benign side of colonization, the racist side, was simply to get black people out of the U.S. And that was Mathew Carey's side. Mathew Carey ran the numbers. He saw the future, and for him, it didn't work. Carey counted the enslaved black population in the South. He calculated its growth. He extrapolated for time to come, saying that there would be an increase of about 50,000 black people per year over the course of the 19th century. And for Mathew Carey, the conclusion was that's just too many black people for the United States. It's too much of a threat of slave rebellion in the South, and he invokes the image, the specter of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, the Haitian Revolution. But he also figures it's too many free blacks, too, because they can be a problem both in the North and the South. And so the solution, Carey says, would lie in colonization, to send these people, as many as could be sent, to Liberia. And Mathew Carey campaigns to get people to raise money to pay for this colonization effort. Now, he's not alone in that. Mathew Carey is not the only colonizationist by any means. He's not the only one to express some degree of white anxiety. But Mathew Carey does have a printing press. He's still in the publishing business. He has the power to promote his ideas. And by the late 1820s, he's using that power to promote two ideas. Infant schools, yes, including the one for black children here in Philadelphia, but also colonization of black people, adults and children alike. And that led me to ask, when I started thinking about Mathew Carey, what's going on here? Is the idea behind black infant schools to prepare black children for colonization, to make them good candidates for sending away? Carey, I have to say, never makes a specific connection. But I think it's worth speculation, it's worth imagination. which I always tell my students is a useful thing to engage in from time to time. And that's Mathew Carey. On the other hand, I think about Betsey Stockton School from her perspective and that of the parents who send their children there. And again, this is, you can see the location and its centrality in this growing black community in Philadelphia. And I try to imagine what's going on inside 60 Gaskell Street on a day-to-day basis. There's one teacher and one assistant, 60, 70, sometimes 80 children, all below the age of 5. And if you know children like that, they have their emotional and occasional biological needs, and somebody has to attend to those. And I wonder, how do Betsey Stockton and her assistant teach this very, very challenging curriculum? And the answer is, I don't know. They apparently do. They apparently do it well. But how? I can't imagine that. But then I try to imagine the scene outside the school, the parents who are dropping their kids off in the morning, picking them up in the afternoon. This is a familiar scene, I think, to all of us. We've engaged in this at various times. But I ask about the parents, what do they want? What's in it for them? Why do they send their children to an infant school? Not to make them good candidates for colonization, I can guarantee you that. But to give their children education, yes, but also protection. I think the school at 60 Gaskell Street is a safe haven from the evil streets of Philadelphia, where black people are often attacked, kidnapped, and the parents must feel the children can be safe inside, at least during the day. And the parents can meet outside and do what parents always do at school drop-off and pick-up. Exchange gossip, but also exchange information. Talk about their kids, talk about jobs, talk about housing, talk about how to get by. My point is that the school is not just a source of education, it's a source of social connection. Not just for toddlers, but for adults in the community too. It's a very important social institution in the black community. And Betsey Stockton is the human glue who holds it together, until she isn't. In 1830, Betsey Stockton hears that Harriet Stewart, her dear friend in Cooperstown, has died. So Betsey Stockton leaves Philadelphia, goes up to Cooperstown to take care of the Stewart children, and she does that for several years. Mathew Carey makes a rather tepid note of her departure, calls her a valuable teacher, but doesn't mention her by name. But then in 1833, Betsey Stockton takes the Stewart children down to Princeton to be educated in the very good private schools and academies in Princeton. And she becomes the first and only teacher in Princeton's only public school for black children. She's a founding member of Princeton's Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, the black church, where she also teaches Sunday school, promoting literacy, not just scripture, but literacy, to adults and children alike. She does that for the rest of her life, from 1833 to 1865, and then she dies and is buried back in Cooperstown in the Stewart family plot. And that Princeton chapter is really the rest of Betsey Stockton's story. It's over 30 years in Princeton, but it's not unlike her 2 years in Philadelphia. She's teaching black children in a town, in a region, the North, and in a society where doing so is often dismissed and disdained and can be, in some cases, dangerous. And I think in the antebellum era, in the antebellum North, even in a genteel-seeming place like Princeton, New Jersey, teaching in the black community can't be taken for granted. It could be, I think, a very courageous calling, even, some might say, a radical act. And I think we need to recognize the significance of that. Now, I want to close with one last consideration, one question. How do we locate Betsey Stockton in history or in historical memory? And I need to be clear here. I want to be very, very clear. She was not an outspoken orator for abolition like Frederick Douglass. She was not a promoter of women's rights like Sojourner Truth. She was not a heroic liberator like Harriet Tubman. And those people deserve their special place in the pantheon of antebellum protest and resistance, especially here in Black History Month. And those are the names we know. I hope we know. And yes, like those figures who moved so widely throughout America in the antebellum era, Betsey Stockton was very well traveled, at least in the first half of her life. My friend David Blight, who writes about Frederick Douglass, said Douglass was the most traveled black man in 19th century America. I think Betsey Stockton might have been the most traveled black woman, especially single black woman, in antebellum America. But after all of her travels, she spends the second half of her life doing essentially one thing. And that is helping to build and sustain institutions in the black community. A church, and above all, 2 schools. Those institutions that help build and sustain the black community. And she does that day after day, year after year, always in the context of the racism that pervades the antebellum North. Not just the South, but again, the North. In Philadelphia and in Princeton. And my point, both in the book and here this afternoon, is that that sort of dogged day-to-day grassroots labor needs to be acknowledged. I argue in the book that Betsey Stockton's persistence was a form of resistance. And I think that needs to count in history. People in Princeton's black community have known that for over a century. She's long been a part of that community's memory. This is a window that is still in the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. It was put there in the 1870s, 1880s. And the scholars there are not the ones at Princeton University, they are her students. There's also a plaque in the church that was put there in 1906. It tells her story about 40 years after her death. This plaque is also still in the church. There's a plaque outside the church dating from 2004. And this is all at Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, her church in Princeton. But now she's also being commemorated more in Princeton's academic community. In 2013, I think my friend Marnie Sandweiss, a professor at Princeton, started the Princeton Slavery Project, putting a focus on race relations in the college, but also in the larger community. And now there are some 900 pages of documents that have been collected, primary documents and essays, including, I will say, mine on Betsey Stockton. If you visit the website, it's worth it. In 2018, Princeton University created the Elizabeth Betsey Stockton Garden out in front, just in front of the library, right between the library and Nassau Street. I think kind of an interesting location for it. They also installed a plaque in 2019 in front of the President's House, which is now the Alumni House at Princeton, listing all the enslaved people who lived in that house. One of them, Betsey Stockton. The first 9 presidents of Princeton were slaveholders, and these are the people that they helped. In 2020, the Princeton Theological Seminary established the Betsey Stockton Center for Black Church Studies, which now I'm happy to say has a wonderful director, Dr. David Lattimore. Inside the Theological Seminary, you can find a Betsey Stockton painting in Hawaiian dress. This painting was commissioned by the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, but it now hangs in the Princeton Theological Seminary, and the artist has tried to take Betsey Stockton back in time to when she was in Hawaii. In 2020, people in Cooperstown secured a state grant to raise Betsey Stockton's tombstone back up. There's the before and there's the after. It had been lying on the ground for some time, and with some effort and some expense, they lifted it back up. I even hear in Cooperstown that somebody at the Glimmerglass Opera is thinking about doing a Betsey Stockton opera, so stay tuned for that one. She's also getting attention in Hawaii, where she lived for a couple of years. In Honolulu, the Hawaiian Mission House's museum features a costumed reenactor telling Betsey Stockton's story, and it's actually quite good. In April and May of this year, the Hawaiian Mission House's museum is also commemorating Betsey Stockton's arrival along with a second batch of missionaries in 1823. And finally, there's another Hawaiian, or former resident of Hawaii, who wrote a letter of commendation about Betsey Stockton in 2020. And Obama focuses on Betsey Stockton's intellect, her piety, but also, as he so often does, on the power of hope. Well, like Barack Obama, I'm hopeful too. Maybe there's more to come about Betsey Stockton, maybe even here in Philadelphia, where there is no memorial to her, at least so far. I'm thinking of a plaque on Gaskell Street. But I hope there's more to come about other people too. Other people in the past who, like Betsey Stockton, have stories that haven't been told. Stories that need to be told, stories that can be told. And I think stories that will be told by the next round of writers, including researchers who, like me, do some of their research right here at the American Philosophical Society. Thank you very much. I am most happy to take questions both from here in the room and I think from the virtual world. Okay. Yes?
Okay. I have,
Well,
wait,
okay,
let
well-
me come and do a microphone
Oh, okay.
so we can hear you.
Thanks. Can I ask 2 data points, and I'm happy for short half answers to both. Sure. Did I hear you correctly that she was freed, but then she was sold to someone else? How can that legally happen? And then my second one is, her salary was $250 a year, I guess, but the money raised was $143 a year. I assume there was no state funding for education.
No.
So who paid the rest of her salary?
I'll answer the easy question first, the second one. There was some holdover money from the previous year, and also there were some smaller contributions, both dollar contributions and in-kind contributions that didn't get reflected in that slide. But the Infant School Society had money to pay the teacher. What they weren't able to do was raise much money for the school, the facility itself. Okay? And now, the first...
I think you said she was free.
Oh, yes. Okay, all right, okay. Well, it happened because both Pennsylvania and New Jersey had very slow, gradual abolition laws. Betsey Stockton, at least to the best of my knowledge, and I've looked through all the records I could, was not technically enslaved, at least after 1810. But she was still in the control, under the authority of, in a form of unfreedom, where she was held by Ashbel Green. And he was able to sell her time, not her body, but her time, to Nathaniel Todd in South Jersey. This is not uncommon, and I think that it happens a lot in New Jersey. There's a book by a scholar named James G. Contino on just the very slow path, the complications of emancipation in New Jersey.
Is there a name to this semi-slavery where you can sell someone's time but not slave?
Yeah, it was called, it was basically a form of indenture. And there's a term that I'm blanking on at the moment.
I mean, indenture is good. So you can free someone, but they're still indentured to you.
Yeah, and they're not technically completely free, okay?
Over here, we have a question, actually, so sorry.
I'm sorry, okay.
Well-
Fine.
Okay, as to her legacy, what has happened with the infant school in Philadelphia and the school in Princeton?
Well, the infant school in Philadelphia lasted for a few years, but as soon as Betsey Stockton left, the enrollment started going way down, which again is a way of telling me something about the quality of her presence, her teaching, her place in the community. Infant schools began to fade out and then become kindergartens later, and when the state started providing public support. Her school in Princeton, it remained a segregated school. Paul Robeson went there after she had gone, of course. And Princeton was still a very racially segregated town. Paul Robeson described it as Jim Crow. And it was only in the 20th century, actually in the 1940s, that Princeton began to integrate its public schools. One point I will say, in 1858, Princeton raised $6,000 to build a new school for whites. Brand new school, bought a lot, built a wonderful building. They raised $50 to repair Betsey Stockton School. Less than 1%. The building's still there. Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks, okay.
All right, there was a question here.
Yes, you said she was in Hawaii for 2 years. Did she write about that, and through the rest of her life, did she reflect on the experience? And one final question, did she learn any Hawaiian dialects?
Yes, she did. There were some Hawaiian men on board the whaling ship that she took to Hawaii the first time, and so she learned some from them, Hawaiian language. She learned to speak Hawaiian, I don't know exactly how fluently, but she learned to speak Hawaiian while she was in Hawaii. And the first half of your question again was?
How much did she write?
Oh, yes, she did, okay.
And did she reflect on it later?
She did. At one point, she tells somebody she really expects to go back to Hawaii and die there. This is after she's left Hawaii. She's always known as Betsey Stockton, late missionary to the Sandwich Islands. That's just a kind of a tagline that goes with her. And she has, and again, her papers, which she talks about in her will, and they're gone. But one of them was a big painting, an engraving of the arrival of missionaries, British missionaries in Tahiti. And this, I think, was, again, part of her connection to that island environment. I think she actually liked being in Hawaii. I think she wanted to go back. It was very much with her. It was part of her identity, both that other people gave her, but I think that she also gave herself.
Hey, Greg, you've studied the 19th century for a long time now.
Since the 19th century?
Yeah. So I was just wondering, working on this book, did your thinking about the 19th century change at all? Did you learn anything new that you didn't know going through this process?
Yeah, of course, you always learn something you don't know. Otherwise, you ought not be doing it. No, I think that, first of all, writing this book took me into sides of Philadelphia, and especially Princeton, New Jersey, a town I thought I knew, but didn't know as well. I think a lot of people have an assumption, still, that the South was the land of slavery, the North was the land of the free. And that's simply not the case. And I think when I saw that being played out in a place like Princeton, which really is the second half of the book, there are some incidents, attacks on black people, largely by Princeton students, half of whom came from the South. It was a very southern college. And so I think to see that these kind of stories that happen in a place like Princeton were really striking and stunning to me. And again, I have to give another plug to my friend Marty Sandweiss and the Princeton Slavery Project, which has provided a much larger picture of the racial context of the university and the community. And I think it extends beyond. New Jersey was the one state never to vote for Lincoln. In ratifying the 13th Amendment, New Jersey came in after Georgia. And I think that kind of, I might call it subtle, genteel, but nonetheless nasty conservatism in New Jersey and in Princeton was something that really struck me quite personally. Yeah.
So we have one last question online.
So this question comes from Julianne from online, from the Boxcast stream. She says, was Robert Stockton related to Richard Stockton? Thinking of Stockton University and wondering whether there is a mention of her there.
Yeah. They were related. They were brothers. The Stockton family was a big Princeton family. Morven, which used to be the governor's mansion and is now a historic site in Princeton, was the home of Richard Stockton. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Robert Stockton was a quartermaster of Washington's during the New Jersey campaign. So yeah, the Stockton family was and remained very powerful, big in Princeton throughout the 19th century.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know about Stockton University, though, if they have any. They should. Okay? They should.
Great. We might have time for one last quick question, if there's one last in the audience, okay? Well, actually, if others have not had a chance to ask a question, okay, thanks.
Yeah, Greg, I'm just curious about what drew you to her in the first place.
It's an interesting story. My wife, with whom you're sitting at the table, we were in Princeton one time, and she happened to be sitting on the Richard Stockton bench, and then drifted down into the black community in Princeton. There was the Betsey Stockton plaque. And she came back and said, Stockton, there might be a story here. You ought to write something. She thought I was going to write an op-ed. I got going, and you keep learning more, and you keep writing.
Well, I think we're out of time, so I hope you'll join me in thanking Greg for this
Thank you.
talk.
Thank you.
And if you'd like, there are a couple of books for sale in the back, so please buy a book. So thanks so
Yes,
much, Greg.
I have a pen.